Welcome back to the new adventures of the monad. We are now one root race away from our own, the fifth root race. There's a good deal of information available regarding the fourth or Atlantean root race. The classic book on the subject, for our purposes, being The Story of Atlantis and Lost Lemuria by W. Scott Elliott. Like Leadbetter, Scott Elliott was able to interrogate the Akashic records to build up a picture of what went on in our dim and distant past. Is he accurate? I have not got a clue. It does chime with what others say, but is what others say based on what he wrote? One way or the other, it makes for a ripping yarn, so we will continue. This book contains also 4 maps covering roughly the following periods. Map 1 from about 1 million years ago to 800,000 years ago. Map 2 from about 800,000 years ago to 200,000 years ago. Map 3 from about 200,000 years ago to 75,025 years ago. Map 4 from about 75,025 to 9,564 BCE. During the first map period, Atlantis extended from a few degrees east of Iceland to about the site now occupied by Rio de Janeiro. It embraced Texas, the Gulf of Mexico, the southern and eastern states of America, Labrador, and the area from there to Ireland, Scotland, and a small portion of north of England. It reached also from Brazil to the African Gold Coast. The second map period shows the distribution of land after the first great catastrophe about 800,000 years ago, in the Miocene age. Much of the north of the continent was submerged, and the rest was rent. The growing American continent was separated by a chasm from the remainder of Atlantis, which then occupied the bulk of the Atlantic basin, from about 50 degrees north latitude to a few degrees south of the equator. Considerable subsidences and upheavals in other parts of the world also took place. The British Isles, for example, forming part of a huge island embracing the Scandinavian peninsula, the north of France, and all the intervening and some of the surrounding seas. The third map period shows the land surface after the second catastrophe, about 200,000 years ago. This catastrophe, however, being relatively much smaller than the first one. Atlantis proper was now split into a northern island called Ruta and the southern one called Daitya. The future North and South America were separated from one another. Egypt was submerged, and the Scandinavian island was joined to the future Europe. The fourth map period shows the land surface after the stupendous convulsion which took place in 75,025 BC. Daitya almost entirely disappeared, and Ruta was reduced to the comparatively small island of Poseidonis, about the center of the Atlantic Ocean. The land surface was then roughly as it is today. Though the British Isles were still joined to Europe, the Baltic Sea was non-existent, and the Sahara Desert was still an ocean. In 9,564 BCE, Poseidonis was finally submerged. The Troano MS, which appears to have been written about 3,500 years ago among the Maya of the Yucatan, translated by Li Plongeon, gives the following description of the submersion of Poseidonis. In the year of 6 Khan, on the 11th Muluk, in the month of Zak, there occurred terrible earthquakes, which continued without interruption until the 13th Chuen. The country of the hills of mud, the land of Mu, was sacrificed. Being twice upheaved, it suddenly disappeared during the night, the basin being continually shaken by the volcanic forces. Being confined caused the land to sink and to rise several times in various places. At last the surface gave way, and tens of countries were torn asunder and scattered. unable to stand the force of the convulsions, they sank with their 64 million inhabitants 8,060 years before the writing of this book. In addition to the 4 great catastrophes mentioned, there were many other minor ones. The initiated kings and priests who followed the good law were aware beforehand of the impending calamities. Each one, therefore, became a center of prophetic warning and ultimately the leader of a band of colonists. The names of the 7 sub-races of Atlantis are as follows. 1. Remohal. 2. Slavatli. 3. Toltec. 4. Turanian. 5. Original Semites. 6. Arcadian. And 7. Mongolian. With the exception of the first 2, the names chosen have been those given by ethnologists to traces of these subraces or parts of them, which they have found. The first 2 are given the names by which they called themselves. Let us now look at the first subrace. Sanat Kumara, the head of the hierarchy, began almost immediately after he came to make arrangements for the founding of the 4th root race. Accordingly, the 4th root race Manu selected the smallest, densest and best of the Lemurians. It is assumed these were from the 4th Lemurian subrace. At the time when they were under the guidance of the king initiates, he arranged for suitable monads to incarnate in the bodies they provided. This was not an easy process, with tribes having to be segregated, their members intermarrying for long periods, the best then being selected and paired off with the best of another segregated party. The Manu and his disciples also incarnated in order to improve their physical appearance. The first thing to note here is that we are quite literally seeing a breeding experiment. This should not come as a surprise, as we have seen this in other chains and in various rounds of our chain. It still, however, comes as a surprise to know that not only were individuals and groups encouraged to breed in certain combinations, from the Bahishad's 46 all the way up to a Manu, which would have at least been a 44 self, had to pass their genetic material into the population. Would this be an entertaining experience for them? I very much doubt it. The evolutionary gap between an Arhat, a 46 self, and a human is the difference between an animal and us today. Does that sound appealing to you? Then, when you consider a Manu, who could be a lower 43 self, is as far away from us evolutionary speaking as we are from the minerals, you begin to get the picture just how big a sacrifice these august beings were making to improve our species. It will be remembered that several initiates and their disciples from the interchain Nirvana had incarnated in the Lemurian 6th subrace, and that they had greatly improved the bodies of that subrace. These improved bodies were also used by the Manu for his purposes, a large number of the developed entities thus taking the lead and pressing things forward. Finally, the Manu took the bodies of the Lemurian 7th subrace, bluish-white individuals, if you remember, improved by the initiates using them as the nucleus of his first subrace of the Atlantean root race, the Remoals. Only this group of initiates and their disciples came into these bodies at first, there being none taken by those who had not previously been evolved on the Earth chain. The colony of the 7th subrace people was settled on land represented by the Ashanti region and western Nigeria, which was then a promontory to the northwest of the island continent. It embraced the Cape of Good Hope and parts of West Africa. The colony was guarded for generations from the admixture with less evolved physical specimens and increased in number until it was ready to receive the new impulse to physical heredity which the Manu was destined to impart. The Manu had eliminated the blue from the color of his people, passing through purple into red, and then by mixing in the white-blue of the Lemurian 7th subrace, obtained a type for the Remoals, which we could call fully human and that we could imagine as living amongst ourselves. About 1 million years were spent in establishing the race type. Stupendous care and trouble had been taken to reach a fair resemblance to the type based on the template that the Manu represented. At this time, it may be said that he founded the race as he took incarnation. The Manu called his disciples to take incarnation in his own family, his progeny thus forming the race. The Manu of a race is, in the most literal sense, its progenitor, for the whole race has its Manu as its physical ancestor. Even Manu's immediate descendants, however, were not very attractive, although a vast improvement in the surrounding population. They were smaller than these, but had no nervous organization worth speaking of, and their ancestral bodies were shapeless. He molded and shaped his physical body after his own emotional and mental bodies, modifying the pigment in the skin until it became approximated to the color designed for the race. This sounds like an impressive feat. How many people wish they could think of themselves as thinner or taller? Well, all you have to do is evolve to at least a 45 self, and then these things become possible. This can't be done in a time frame that most YouTube videos would have you believe. But persevere, and it will come to pass. After this initial intervention by the Manu, many generations passed before the young root race took possession of its continent, Atlantis. From this point forward, batches of monads began to come in from the interchain nirvana to inhabit the fourth root race bodies. It is worth noting here that the Manu of the fourth race was one of the adepts from Venus. It is worth asking the question here, how do you go about developing a new root race from its predecessor? The general principle seems to be that a root race is developed from the numerically corresponding subrace of the preceding root race. Thus, the fourth root race should, by the rule, have been developed from the fourth subrace of the third root race. The fifth root race was developed from the fifth subrace of the fourth root race, whilst the sixth root race will be developed from the sixth subrace of the fifth root race. This diagram illustrates the process. In the case of the fourth root race, however, it seems that it was not until the time of the seventh Lemurian subrace that humanity was sufficiently developed physiologically to warrant the final choice of individuals fit to become the parents of the new root race. The Romual race came into existence between 4 and 5 million years ago. Much of Lemuria still existed, and Atlantis had not yet become as large as it eventually became. The Romual race was born about latitude 7 degrees north and longitude 5 west, at a place which is now the Ashanti coast. It was hot, a moist country where huge antediluvian animals lived in reedy swamps and dank forests. The fossil remains of such plants are now in our coal seams, according to Scott Elliott. I personally doubt this. The race was at first mahogany black in color. They were about 10 to 12 feet high, their stature dwindling gradually through the centuries. They ultimately migrated to the southern shores of Atlantis, where they fought with the Lemurian 6th and 7th subraces. Some of them settled down and intermarried with the Black Lemurians. Others reached the extreme northeastern promontories contiguous with Iceland. Here they gradually became lighter in color and about 1 million years ago could almost be described as being fair. Their occupation of these northern lands was not unbroken, because at intervals they were driven south by glacial epochs. A minor glacial epoch occurs about every 30,000 years. In addition, there are major epochs, one of which was in process about 3 million years ago. The Romuals, being the children of the new race, were themselves incapable of developing any plan of settled government. Nor did they reach even as high a point of civilization as the Lemurian 6th and 7th subraces. They were ruled, therefore, by the Manu himself, or by other adepts or divine rulers. What was changing was that they were becoming more mentally rather than intuitionally focused. This was, however, a slow process and did not come to fruition until the fifth root race. The brachycephalous or round-headed specimen known as Foru's man may be taken as a fair average of what the Romual looked like as their subrace began to decay. The modern Lapps, with some infusion of other blood, are descendants of the scattered and vestigial remnants of the Romuals. The government of the Romuals have been presented here in a sketchy form. The memory of their divine ruler was preserved, and in due time he came to be regarded as a god. Being to a certain extent psychic, the Romuals adopted a religion which, though not profoundly philosophical, was far from degenerate. In later days, this phase of religious belief passed into a kind of ancestral worship. Among the Romuals, art and science were crude in the extreme. That wraps it up for the first subrace from Atlantis. It may not sound much, but it was a beginning, and many things were to spring from this humble start. Some were great, others less so. We will get to those as we pass now into the second subrace. See you in the next presentation. Thank you.